In 1974, with a war veteran named Max Eriksson sitting on a subway train. When a young Vietnamese woman enters the train, Eriksson looks at her with a distressed look. She suddenly reminds him of his time in the Vietnam War. The scene then moves to a flashback during the Vietnam War in 1966. A team of American scouts receives a mission to search for hidden tunnels used by the Viet Cong to launch surprise attacks. One night, while they're in a thick forest, they hear mortar fire. They check the map and realize that nearby soldiers are under attack by the enemy. Lieutenant Riley directs his team to listen to the gunfire, to determine where the enemy is, and then inform headquarters about their current location. Suddenly, due to panic, one of the soldiers initiates shooting at a Vietnamese soldier. This exposes their concealment, and the enemy becomes aware of their location. Shortly after, mortar fire commences, resulting in casualties among some soldiers, while others scramble to find safety. Meanwhile, young Private First Class Max Eriksson, who is patrolling alone, seeks refuge upon hearing an explosion nearby. Abruptly, the ground trembles, causing him to tumble into a concealed Viet Cong tunnel, where his legs become trapped. As aerial support arrives and begins attacking the enemy, Eriksson remains ensnared in the tunnel. Unbeknownst to him, a Viet Cong soldier wielding a knife silently approaches him through the narrow passage. Before the soldier can strike, Sergeant Tony Meserve successfully rescues Eriksson. Subsequently, the Americans regroup and systematically eliminate the enemies, one by one. The following day, Eriksson, Meserve, and their unit consisting of Corporal Thomas Clark, Private Hatcher, and Sergeant Brownie head to a nearby river village for temporary refuge. Eriksson stands out from his team as he shows kindness to the local children, unlike his comrades who are distrustful of everyone in Vietnam. Despite the tense wartime atmosphere, Eriksson maintains his humanity by treating the locals with respect and offering assistance when necessary. Later, Sergeants Brownie and Messer emphasize to their troops the significance of following orders unquestioningly, particularly as their time in Vietnam is drawing to a close. However, at that moment, Viet Cong soldiers lie in wait in the foliage, alongside local informants. They suddenly open fire on the Americans, fatally wounding Sergeant Brownie. This catches the American soldiers entirely by surprise, but they successfully fend off the assault and eliminate the adversaries. After this event, Meserve's unit is granted a 48-hour furlough, and they make plans for an evening out in the nearby town. However, their furlough is suddenly revoked, and they are instructed to report for patrol duty at 6 a.m. the following day. That night, they conduct a reconnaissance mission in the vicinity. Meserve, saddened by the loss of his dear friend Brownie, expresses his wish to find solace in the company of a local girl in the closest village. Later in the evening, the unit arrives at the gate of their outpost to proceed to the village. However, a sentry and their company leader refuse them entry to a brothel. The leader informs them that the area remains restricted to them. Consequently, the team is compelled to remain confined to their position until further directives are issued. Recognizing their predicament, the troops return to the barracks and await their morning march. Sergeant Meserve then introduces Private First Class Antonio Diaz to the unit as a replacement for the deceased Brownie. Meserve provides the unit with details on their upcoming mission and discloses that they will depart the following day, 2 hours earlier than originally planned. He expresses his desire to visit the nearby village and abduct a local girl for their own satisfaction. Eriksson is appalled by his superior's shocking and unlawful statement. He expresses his concerns to his companion, but the latter reassures him that Meserve must be jesting. Unfortunately, the next morning, the unit arrives at the village and forcibly takes a young girl named Tan Tyon away from her family. Meserve notifies Eriksson that they will be enjoying the girl once they arrive at their post. Shortly afterward, pandemonium ensues in the village as relatives beg the soldiers to spare the girl. However, the soldiers ignore all their pleas. Instead, they perpetrate a dreadful deed against the girl's sister, leaving Eriksson stunned and unable to comprehend how his comrades could commit such an act. After seizing the village girl for their twisted entertainment, the soldiers proceed with their tasks. Eriksson challenges Sergeant Meserve, asserting that their actions constitute a crime, but Meserve dismisses his objections and sends him on patrol. Meanwhile, Private Hatcher and Corporal Clark see no issue with Meserve's behavior, treating it as amusement. Later, the group takes a pause and endeavors to engage with the captive girl. Clark approaches her initially, but he gets interrupted by Hatcher, who believes he spots someone in the bushes. He fires a shot, only to realize it was merely an animal. The squad then understands that the gunshot might have exposed their position to the enemy, so they opt to move forward, postponing any further interaction with the girl. A while later, they stumble upon an empty wooden cabin deep in the forest. While Meserve, Clark, and Hatcher survey the area, Diaz and Eriksson tidy up the cabin. Diaz turns out to be inclined to mistreat the girl. Since they share the same viewpoint, Diaz and Eriksson agree to back each other up. They aim to ensure that no one is coerced into committing a wrongdoing. Eriksson then approaches the captured girl Owen, demonstrating empathy and concern for her. He effectively earns her confidence and attends to her wounds. Later, upon the squad's return to the cabin, Sergeant Meserve proposes forcefully questioning the girl. He binds her hands and specifies the sequence in which the soldiers will abuse her. Eriksson is undeniably appalled by the plan. He and Diaz object to it, stating they will not partake in the assault. However, the sergeant warns them of social exclusion if they refuse to comply. This intimidates Diaz, and he reluctantly agrees to participate in the dreadful act. Infuriated, Eriksson tries to assist the girl, but Clark holds a knife to his throat and instructs him to keep watch for the night. A vulnerable Eriksson then observes his comrades, committing the atrocious act. The following morning, the squad reaches a hillside and positions themselves on a railway bridge overlooking a Viet Cong River supply depot. They leave Owen with Clark back in the cabin. Nearby, they spot an armed Vietnamese group transporting artillery shells. They relay the coordinates to headquarters and keep watch on the enemy while preparing for their mission. Later, Eriksson and Hatcher return to the outpost to restock and acquire smoke grenades. Upon reaching the cabin, Clark hesitates to stay with the girls, so he orders Eriksson to take his place. Once they are alone, Eriksson fully comprehends the severity of Owen's abuse. She is feeble, wounded, bruised, dehydrated, and ill. He feels awful for her condition, so he releases her binds and offers her food and drink. Meanwhile, at the railway bridge, Sergeant Meserve is furious when his men return without Eriksson, so he instructs Clark to return to the outpost to fetch him. The sergeant is concerned that Eriksson might take extreme action. Meanwhile, Eriksson resolves to assist Owen in returning to her village. However, she's too frightened to go alone, so she pleads for Eriksson to accompany her. Eriksson realizes that leaving the outpost with Owen would constitute desertion. He could face consequences for this. Nevertheless, moved by the girl's desperate plea, he decides to proceed. Just as they are on the verge of fleeing, Clark shows up and halts them. He compels them to rejoin the squad on the railway bridge. Regrettably, Eriksson and Owen are dragged to the bridge and instructed to remain as the squad awaits their attack. Owen suddenly starts coughing due to her frail health. Meserve realizes that she could jeopardize their position, so he orders Eriksson to eliminate her. Our protagonist declines, so the sergeant directs Hatcher to do it, but he also hesitates. As helicopters approach in the distance, Meserve urgently commands Diaz to kill her. Under his superior's pressure, Diaz chooses to perform the unthinkable. Just then, Eriksson shoots his rifle into the air to divert the Viet Cong's attention and successfully prevents the killing. During the ensuing exchange of fire between the American and Vietnamese soldiers, Clark repeatedly stabs Owen. Unfortunately, Eriksson fails to spot them as he's too engrossed in repelling the adversaries. The situation becomes dire as the Viet Cong advances with mortars up the river and begins firing at the bridge. However, Meserve and his team respond effectively by utilizing a machine gun to eliminate the enemies one by one. Meanwhile, severely wounded Owen rises and tries to flee across the bridge below. Upon noticing her, Meserve commands the squad to shoot her. Eriksson attempts to intervene, but Meserve hits him with his firearm, knocking him down. Subsequently, the squad fires multiple shots at the helpless girl, ending her life instantly. Her motionless body then plunges off the bridge and onto the ground below. Following the incident, Meserve leads his men away from the scene. While Eriksson lies on the railroad alone, he faintly sees the American fighters conducting an airstrike on the enemy's riverboat and also notices Owen's disfigured body below. The ensuing blast engulfs a nearby U.S. Navy vessel, killing all of its crew. Shortly after, Eriksson is evacuated by helicopter. He awakens in a hospital and confides in his comrade Rowan about the abduction, assault, and killing of Owen. Rowan comprehends his worry and advises him to converse with Lieutenant Riley. Eriksson does so, but regrettably, Riley responds with a lengthy justification. He underscores how the occurrence could blemish the unit's operational history and implies that it would be preferable to disregard it. Determined to pursue justice, our protagonist jeopardizes his military career by defying Riley's directives and reporting the event to Captain Hill. However, Hill also responds firmly and scolds Eriksson. He cautions him that pursuing the issue might lead to severe penalties for the soldiers and could result in retaliation against Eriksson and his family once the convicted men are released. Meanwhile, Meserve discovers that Eriksson had informed the higher-ranking officers about Owen. This fills him with fury, and he resolves to eliminate him with a grenade. That evening, Eriksson grows suspicious when he observes Hatcher lurking by the latrine door and hastily fleeing. Fortunately, he notices the grenade and swiftly jumps out of the latrine just before it detonates. Eriksson then challenges Meserve and the other culprits. He informs them that everyone is already aware of their actions. However, the authorities refuse to heed him. He proposes they let him be because they'll never face punishment for their atrocious deed. Later, Eriksson drowns his sorrows at a tavern. A clergyman approaches him and inquires about his demeanor. Despite knowing justice won't prevail, Eriksson confides in the clergyman about the tragedy involving the village girl. Soon, an inquiry is initiated, and Owen's corpse is found by the riverside. This heightens the tension within the unit, and Captain Hill notifies Eriksson that his actions will bear consequences as he couldn't overlook the situation. In the subsequent scene, all the soldiers are individually interrogated, and they admit to their transgressions. Consequently, they face court-martial. Meserve is sentenced to 10 years of hard labor, Diaz to 8 years, Hatcher to 15, and Clark to life. As they depart the tribunal, Meserve leans near Eriksson and whispers something unintelligible with a sinister gleam in his eyes. The scene then shifts to the present. Eriksson emerges from his disturbing flashback on the train. Upon reaching the subsequent station, the Vietnamese lady, reminiscent of Owen, alights. He observes that she has forgotten her scarf. Eriksson promptly retrieves it and exits the train to return it to her. Approaching the woman, she notices a troubled expression on his countenance. Inquiring about it, Eriksson informs her that he just awoke from a nightmare. The woman then expresses gratitude for the scarf and extends solace to him, reassuring him that his ordeal is now in the past. As the film draws to a conclusion, a faint smile appears on Eriksson's face.